After the first presentation today, I just want to give a round of applause to Bob, Carlos, and Bill Fletcher. I thought it was a really great discussion, so thank you very much. They started talking about reliability and security as well, and the purpose of the standard, and also controls. And so we're going to continue on with the control discussion and share some best practices and some ways that you can actually use some examples that we'll share with you to improve or enhance your internal controls program. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up Molly Elliott, who is a senior technical analyst here at WECC, to talk about that.
Thank you, Kim. We're going to see if I can learn how to use this. I forgot to double check that I can do it. I can, great. So as Kim said, my name is Molly Elliott. I'm a senior technical analyst in the oversight planning group at WECC, and I specialize in internal controls. And following NextEra is going to be a challenge because they've already covered a lot of the same principles that I want to talk about. But I'd like to take a step back and assume that most of you are not ready to implement a program like NextEra just presented. And so I'm talking to the rest of you, taking a step back and looking at basic principles that you can use in your organization. So we're going to start with how internal controls fit into the ERO Enterprise Risk-Based Monitoring Framework. Follow that with how to use failure points in identifying the need for controls, how to select appropriate controls, and we'll give you a few examples there, and then how to set up a program for continuous improvement. So, basic, what is an internal control? The definition that I've put up here is the working definition from the ERO Enterprise today. Internal controls are the processes, practices, policies, or procedures, systems, applications, and technology tools an entity employs to address risk associated with the reliable operation of its business. But you'll notice I've separated this into 3 parts on the screen. So on the left-hand side, we have a list of discrete activities that would also be called control activities, if you've heard us use that term. In some definitions, you might also see mechanisms or techniques in this column. But there are 2 conditions on the right. First, an entity employs. That means it needs to be implemented. And second is that it must address a risk. So internal controls address risk. But what is risk? Well, Vic talked a lot with us already about what a risk is, so you probably have a pretty good handle on this already. But within the business context, a risk is anything that jeopardizes achieving your defined goals. So as an organization, those defined goals could be operating effectively and efficiently, protecting electric assets from loss, providing reliable electricity, or compliance with applicable laws, policies, and procedures. Now, your entity may or may not have an enterprise risk management program already. If you do, you're a step ahead, but you do have business objectives, and you have steps that you need to take to meet those business objectives. Now, we have the tendency to go straight to controls and not talk about those objectives, because sometimes the risk that your controls address, in fact, just kind of seem intuitive, so you don't think to write them down. From WECC's perspective, the first objective is reliability. What do we need to do to have a reliable system? So again, it's intuitive. We know that we need maintenance programs. We know that we need protection systems to protect our equipment, and we don't think about it in terms of risk. The risk protection systems addressed could be damage to equipment, or it could be cascading outages. Both of those impact reliability. Okay, let's take security. Well, we know intuitively that barriers protect against physical attack and encryption protects against cyber attack. We don't need to do a huge risk analysis to know that. So it's really easy to go with our gut. But in reality, we're talking about layers of risk, where reliability and security are those high-level risks. And then things like protecting our equipment are going to be those operational risks or those next level. Okay, but why are we talking about controls, meaning WECC? Well, the NERC standards are designed to address risks to reliability and security. Curtis already talked to us a lot about this, but I have up here a SAR, or a Standards Authorization Request. And you'll see on the screen in the SAR, there's a field to address risk to the BES, and there's a field to write down the purpose or goal being addressed. Second, once the standard is written, and we've heard reference to this already as well, there's a purpose statement in the standard. So in this case, I've put up EOP 12. The risk statement in the SAR is the risk to the BPS when generators fail to prepare adequately for extreme cold weather conditions. And from the purpose statement of the standard, the effects of operating in extreme cold weather. Again, this equates to your higher level risk mitigation objective. That is the mitigation of the risk identified as applying across the industry. This doesn't address risks specific to your organization necessarily. EOP 12 does require some very specific controls of your organization, like calculation of ECWT and identification of critical components. But it leaves a lot of leeway for your organization to make specific decisions about your business objectives. For example, the method you use to identify the critical equipment and how you protect that equipment is left up to you. Remember, the NERC standards address risk by focusing on required actions or results, the what, and not necessarily the methods by which to accomplish those actions or results, the how. So therefore, understanding the controls employed by your entity to mitigate the reliability and security risk is integral to WECC's understanding of how you meet the standard objective. The ERO enterprise is not just implementing risk-based standards. They've also moved to risk-based monitoring framework. The understood risk to reliability and security that your operations present is reflected in the timing, the scope, and the type of engagement you're going to have with WECC. Effectively designed and implemented controls reduce your entity's risk and are therefore considered in our monitoring plans. This risk also then provides the context for discussions during our engagements. And as part of our focus on risk, controls also play a central part in the enforcement process as you discuss the risk of future non-compliance during any mitigation. So, how might you address this in your organization? Where do we need controls? The first step is identifying the need. The first step is looking at the high-level risk or hurdles to meeting your business objectives. If your entity has an enterprise risk management program, again, you should be integrated into that program. If not, I do want to point to a couple ERO enterprise resources that are available to help you. First is the Compliance Monitoring and Enforcement Implementation Plan, or CMEPIP, which is published annually. It includes the ERO enterprise identification of existing and emerging risks, known as risk elements in the report, to reliable and secure operations. It includes a mapping to standards and requirements for those that would find this helpful. Next, let's take a look at WECC's risk register. Now, Vic already told us a lot about WECC's risk register, but I want to point out that risks are given scores for both likelihood and impact here, but they're not necessarily mapped directly to standards and requirements. However, they do address reliability and security risks specifically. We've already discussed analysis of the purpose statements of the standard. You'll need to ask yourself if that risk is fully mitigated by just simply complying, or if there are additional considerations. There usually will be. And in our last presentation, we had a great example of asking what is the purpose statement and how we address those risks. And then finally, the industry groups periodically look at emerging risks. And again, I want to refer to earlier presentations. Vic talked a lot about committees with WECC that you can get involved with, and Curtis talked about standards development committees that you can be on. But of course, there are other industry groups as well. And interacting with your peers may bring new risks to light for your organization. So once you've considered the high-level risks and the corresponding objectives, it's time to get down to the process level. Begin by understanding the processes or activities that directly support your business objectives. Ask yourself what could go wrong. This is going to help you identify where controls might be needed to address risk. If you skip this step, your controls will miss the mark. Let's just take a real-world example. We all know that a fence is a physical control. But let's say my husband comes home one day and says, I think we should build a fence. And I say, great, I'm going to call the contractor. And I have a beautiful 3-foot white picket fence installed in my front yard. Is this a control? Well, it could be, yes, if the risk that I'm trying to mitigate is a toddler running into the street. But if the risk that I'm trying to mitigate is a 60-pound dog getting out of the yard, the answer is no, this is not an effective control. So you have to start with the risk. So we have a process map. We identify the parts of the process that are required to achieve the objective. Let's walk through a couple examples. Here's a high level, and I understand a very high level depiction of the process to grant physical access to BES cyber systems. To reduce the likelihood of a failure, we first need to identify the failure points and apply a control. So we're going to try a slide out and see if it works. I know Curtis had some trouble with it, so if everyone would take out their phones. The question here is, what can go wrong with the physical access control process, or the granting of physical access? As a hint, I've listed 4 common failure points that you could apply to multiple processes, but you don't need to limit yourself to these. But do think about handoffs, exchanges of information or data, time constraints, and tasks with no distinct owner. And I can see there are some participants typing. Do I need to advance this, Maylee? Here we go. Okay. Well, yes, all of the above. Varying vendors, garbage in, garbage out. Too many people in the process, information tracking, inadvertent permissions. Yes, we've seen that. So if we stick with the specific categories that we talked about, I want to point to a couple of things. The biggest one here that I've seen is handoffs and exchanges of information. In many organizations, there are 4 distinct groups here. We have the requester, we have the approver, probably their manager, we have an HR group that is responsible for the PRA, and we have a physical security group of some sort who's responsible for issuing the badge. Each of them have roles and responsibilities in the process, but there are breakdowns if there's not strong communication between them. Well, technology is usually used to make this process a little more controlled, but we have seen where the technology doesn't talk to each other. And so perhaps the approver needs to go in and check to make sure that the PRA is current. And if they're doing that manually, there's an opportunity for them to either skip a step or misunderstand the report that they've run for HR, right? So time constraints as well. Reperformance of a PRA is on a 7-year schedule. We're going to have some sort of technical controls here. That's a long time to remember. But some organizations may take it a step further and control, say, with automatic revocation of badges if the PRA isn't current. But you need the systems to talk to each other to do that. So we're going to try this again with facility ratings. I would say this is almost even a higher level facility ratings process. But what needs to be done here? We need to have a good inventory. We need to group things into a facility and determine our ratings based on a methodology. Consider manual processes, external dependencies, changes, exceptions, and non-routine actions. I'm not seeing answers here yet. Here we go. Okay, changes were not tracked. Yes, that's probably the number one thing we see, right? So changes in inventory are often a manual activity. And if you don't have a process to manage those changes, you're going to have a problem there. Also, exceptions and non-routine actions feed into this. Your organization may be excellent in incorporating planned changes, but you're going to need controls around changes that happen in the field or urgent changes to make sure that your inventory stays up to date. And from an external dependency standpoint, facilities may include elements owned by interconnecting entities. So you're going to need some sort of controls around that process of communicating with those entities. And we're not going to do a Slido for this one, but I want to talk about information and communication flow. And actually, this is what I heard the most of in that NextEra presentation, that they were, yes, they were managing data and databases, but they were managing the information. They started talking about how they had all this information already in, say, their tripwire, but they didn't have visibility into that. And that's really the principle of making sure, the second principle here we're talking about, which is access to the information. Now, you're going to want to take a look at accuracy, access, and timelines for manual processes as well. NextEra gave us a great example of a technological control here, but accuracy is important in oral communications. That's why we have protocols. Access to information comes into play during any handoff, whether it's manual or technical. And an example for timelines of information might be ensuring that all the information that you need for your studies is there when you need to perform those studies. So once you've determined your risk and your failure points, it's time to think about how you're going to apply controls to your process. Now, selecting controls is going to be very specific to the risk, to your organization, to the process you're looking at, and to your budget. And there are a lot of different ways to look at controls. I think most of what we've talked about today is the prevent, detect, correct classification. That classification scheme focuses on the purpose of the control. Preventative controls are designed to prevent errors or issues from happening in the first place. Detective controls help detect those issues after they occur, but they allow for timely corrective action. And of course, the corrective controls, they could be automation or processes, but they're implemented after the detective control discovers a problem. Sometimes people throw deterrent controls into this mix as well, because some preventative controls, it's really a struggle to consider that they rise to the level of a preventative control. An example of this might be the signage that you have telling your employees not to plug a USB into their laptop. It's really easy to circumvent, and that signage definitely is deterrent. It's certainly not detective or corrective, so we kind of have to throw it into the preventative, but it's a little uncomfortable to throw it all the way into preventative if we're actually categorizing it, correct? The next way I want to talk about internal controls, and I've seen some of our organizations using this scheme, is focusing on the form that the control takes. Is it a physical control? Is it an automated control? Or is it a procedural control? And some people would call procedural controls administrative controls here. Physical controls are things like locks, security systems, restricted access to safeguard assets, etc. Automated controls include things like system-generated checks, validations, restrictions in software to prevent or detect errors, and procedural controls are documents. It's your standard operating procedures, your manuals, other types of documentation. Notice, though, that these procedural controls, if they're well designed, will probably indicate where physical and automated controls reside in your process. And the third way I want to talk about today is people, process, and technology. This one's a little different because it's not one that you're necessarily always going to be able to throw your control into a bucket here. The underlying theory here is that the three of these must work together in your organization, and a change in one area impacts another. People, of course, refers to the individuals in your organization responsible for executing projects. I did love hearing at the very end of the NextEra Q&A when I think it was Carlos said that even though he'd given this great presentation about technology controls, he was most proud of what they did with the people and making sure that they hired the right people to make this work. Process controls enable the work by acting as a foundation that aligns the people with the culture and the quality of work that an initiative needs. You need processes to guide teams through the proper steps and protocols when executing tasks. And the technology component here refers to the tools and systems you use to support or enable your team to carry out those processes. Now, it seems like we're missing physical controls here, but this framework lumps any kind of equipment into technology. So on the next slide, I'm going to try to show how some of these might interact. Let's take the objective of preventing intrusion by a bad actor. Well, just from the objective, we know we're going to have preventative controls. So I've selected a fence, a security guard, and a sign-in sheet. The three controls I selected are obviously all have preventative functions, but the security guard also has detective and corrective functions. Why is that? We're not expecting the security guard just to stand there and block the way, are we? We're expecting that if someone gets by, he's going to detect that intrusion and going to take corrective action. Similarly, the sign-in sheet is preventative or deterrent, but it also is detective because we can use it after the fact to analyze that intrusion, investigate that intrusion. But how else can we look at it? I see two physical and one procedural controls. Though if we substitute the sign-in sheet with a PAC system that automatically logs entry, that could be a technical control there. And the third way, people, process, technology, well, we've covered all three of them here, haven't we? So in the end, it really doesn't matter what framework or combined frameworks we use or how you throw controls into a certain bucket, as long as you understand the different concepts and look for varied ways to control those failure points. In fact, a strong program will use the established frameworks to benchmark or evaluate their program, but the program might not fit neatly into any one framework, and that's okay. Now, I want to spend a little extra time on procedural controls, specifically because this is really the entry-level control, and every single one of our entities is submitting procedures to us as controls. Procedures are controls in that they mitigate the risk of a lack of knowledge or a lack of understanding. You don't know what to do without them. They promote consistency, they promote repeatability, even when employees are absent or you have high turnover. They're comparatively inexpensive, and they're probably the simplest to implement. They also have the benefit of allowing you to track how the process changes over time and understand what constitutes an exception to a process. And they're particularly important for processes that aren't done often, such as emergency response. But I want to take a different example here. Procedural controls need to be detailed and actionable. So when my grandmother passed, I found this recipe for cookies in her recipe files. I'd eaten these cookies every Christmas for 30 years. But yeah, I had a lot of trouble reproducing these cookies, even with this recipe. So Slido time, what's missing from this recipe? Grandmother is missing, yes. I want to start with step-by-step instructions, though. Wait a second. I loved those cookies. I think love was there. Flour was actually not missing. The ingredients were correct. Okay, so what was missing? First, you need to know why you're doing what you're doing. And in this case, there was no line that told me how many cookies I was making. Now, is that really important? Yes, because I need to know what size to make them in order for the baking time and temperature to make sense. So don't skip over things that you think people should know. There was incomplete information there, or tribal knowledge. It said we needed 2 cans of almond paste. Okay, well, I went to the grocery store and almond paste doesn't come in cans anymore. It comes in 7-ounce tubes or 8-ounce boxes. So what do I need? Do I need 7 ounces or 8 ounces? I didn't know. Also, apparently, which brand of almond paste you choose does make a difference, because a different grind of almond paste is actually, some are finer and some are coarser, and that's going to affect the cookies. But the big one is step-by-step instructions, which all of you pointed out. It turns out that the first time I tried to make these, I did what anyone would do and threw all the ingredients in the stand mixer and tried to mix them all up. Apparently that's not the way you make these. You have to use a double boiler and get them to blend properly in a double boiler. That's not what I would have guessed. And there are a few other parts that I was able to guess here, and that is just by the list, I was able to figure out that third egg white is used to brush on the cookies, and then you roll it in the pine nuts. But that's because I was familiar with the cookies. And if you're wanting to write procedures that someone who's not familiar with the cookies can use, you're going to have to include some of that information. So getting back to the procedural controls you care about, even well-designed procedural controls have some drawbacks. They're easy to circumvent. Circumvention could be due to fraud. It could be due to resistance, or it honestly could just be due to skipping steps in a process because you've done it so many times, you think you don't need to follow it. Procedural controls are also susceptible to the human error factor. Well-designed automated controls are less likely to be prone to the human error. And finally, the procedural controls, unless designed to do so, may not produce enough evidence to monitor the effectiveness of the process. And this is why it's common to layer controls or select controls from more than one category and not rely 100% on those procedural controls. So getting back to the categories, I am not going to read every control example here, but I do want to point out that a control can be seen from multiple points of view, as we said, function, method, or form. And here's a grid of common control activities and how they relate to each other from a function and method standpoint. So if you want to control for human factors, you can implement preventative controls such as training, detective controls such as reviews, or corrective controls such as disciplinary actions. The people controls, if we want to talk about it from that standpoint, are typically procedural in form. If you focus on the process, you can prevent circumventing the process through segregation of duties or checklists. You can detect through internal audit, or you can correct through business continuity plans. The processes listed here could be procedural or they could be automated if you look at it from a form perspective. An example of that would be the change authorization, which is a preventative control that focuses on process, but it can be manual or it can be automated. Some of these controls aren't going to necessarily be procedural. Those would be things like audits or field walkdowns. Finally, if you're focused on technology, you can have preventative controls like firewalls, detective controls such as alarms, or corrective controls like patching. Technology-focused controls can take the form of automation, or like a firewall does, or physical controls such as locks. So if you Google it, the British physicist and mathematician William Thomson Kelvin may have said, what is not defined cannot be measured. What is not measured cannot be improved. We actually do have evidence that he said something much more wordy and esoteric, but the internet likes their pithy sayings, and so do I. So the title of this presentation is Strengthening Internal Controls. And documentation and measurement are essential to strengthening your internal controls. Set up your program to be measured and reviewed. Now, yesterday, someone asked Ben and Josh a somewhat leading question of really whether performance or documentation was more important. And I guess we can all agree that performance is more important than documentation, but without the documentation, you're unlikely to continue with high performance, and you're definitely not going to be improving your performance. So you must document your current state to ensure you continue in that level of performance. You must document evidence of performance of control so that you understand whether or not you're actually doing what you think you are doing. You must document lessons learned so that you can move forward with improvement. I liked Ben Miller's comment that measurement frameworks allow for flexibility and creativity. That's not how we usually think about it, but I think it is true when you're talking about continuous improvement of controls. Now, you'll notice too that this is the first time I've used the word program. Do you really need a program, or can you just implement controls where they're needed in a process? And that's a tough one, because depending on the size of the entity, my answer may be a little different. Having a centralized program may not be necessary for our smallest entities, but to promote consistency and improvement, you need to have clear responsibilities for documentation, measurement, and implementation of lessons learned. And that probably means you're looking at a decentralized program. So from a measurement standpoint, I want to point out that there are two types of measurement to consider. The first is indicators of a healthy program. These are not direct measurements of outcome. It's like using a water meter to detect a leak in the house, right? You're not going to go open up your walls and check every pipe for a water leak unless you have some indicator that there might be a water leak. So if your water usage is staying steady over time, that's enough of a measurement for you. Once the water usage rises, that's when you start looking for the cause. Some indicators that you might consider would be frequency of errors or events, the level of rework your people are needing to do to avoid errors, the length of time that it takes to find an issue. Think about the time it takes you to detect PNCs. I think Ben gave us a nice chart on that yesterday. You might look at repeated root cause of errors or malfunctions, or benchmarking your performance against others in the industry. Again, these are all only indicators. They're not direct measures and aren't conclusive on their own, but they do help you target your direct assessments. Now, backing up a second, I want to point out that we understand that PNCs or events, while they may be signs that your preventative controls aren't working, the discovery of those PNCs or events could be a sign that your detective controls are working. So be very careful when you interpret these indicators, because events aren't an indicator that controls designed to detect the event or even necessarily correct the event are flawed. You should, of course, be conducting periodic assessments or direct measurements. This is where you compare your controls against your identified risks. Depending on the complexity of your organization, you might do annual assessments, or you might spread it out a little and look more at certain risks than others. And while WECC monitoring engagements are periodic assessments, you shouldn't be waiting for WECC to come around. Your internal assessments should be triggered by your internal assessment of the process risk. And don't forget to do a periodic risk assessment itself. New risks emerge, and evaluating your controls against a stagnant list of risks does not serve your business objectives. Now, when you're doing a direct controls assessment, there are two aspects to keep in mind. One is design and one is implementation, and together they make an effective control. Effectiveness is based on two components. Oh, I just said that. Never mind. The very first question you ask is the control designed to mitigate the identified risk. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here because I know everybody's been talking about risks today, yesterday and today. Does it address your potential failure points? Does it do so alone or in conjunction with other controls? Once you've established that the control is designed to the objective, look at reliability. Does it work every time? Is it easy to work around or avoid? Does it allow for exceptions? Now, this is a tricky question because depending on whether or not your process has a moderate to high incident of expected exceptions, you may want the answer to be yes, or your employees will be circumventing that control regularly for those exceptions. So you want to actually build in exception processes in some cases. Does it address potential human performance issues? Is it easy to use and understand? Does it add to work? Is information flow and communication addressed? How is information obtained and transmitted and viewed? Is monitoring built in? Does it include quality control, data verification, peer review, performance reports? I want to point out that WECC has published, and this slide says 25 controls guidance that might help you in this process of directly assessing your controls. But it turns out that yesterday we published SIP 12-2, so we now have 26 online for you. These are not a substitution for your own risk assessment, but they may help you when you walk through the design to help with that failure point evaluation, and they may serve as examples to help you double check your controls assessments. Once you've determined the design is good, you need to look at the implementation. There are a couple different ways you might do this. The first is inquiry. Ask your SMEs about their understanding of the implementation of the controls. Do they know what to do? You need to make sure you do this. It's particularly helpful for controls that are performed less frequently. You may look at a demonstration of the functionality of your technologies. Inspection is when you examine documents and reports to assess the control operations. Take a look at completed checklists. Take a look at reviewer sign-offs. Make sure that your processes are actually being followed. Now, you may only need to look at a sample of evidence if your process is one that produces a lot of evidence. I'm not saying you need to do this for every single document, but this is how you know whether your control is being implemented properly. And don't forget, the final step is remediating deficiencies. If you find something wrong with the control, you need to change it. So should be obvious, but if there is a problem with the control design, then change it so that it better meets your objectives. If there's a problem with the implementation, you're going to have to dig a little deeper to understand what is the implementation issue. You may need to add in some technical controls so that it's more difficult to circumvent, or you may need to add in training. There's more than one way to address implementation. And don't forget that you have corrective actions that need to be documented here. If you want to know that you've corrected the problems that you've discovered with your controls, then you need to be tracking that. And finally, any controls that are changed should be reevaluated after the control improvements are made. Now, I crammed a lot of high-level information into a very short presentation, and I could go on further about these, but I don't want to overwhelm you. I just want to encourage you that it doesn't matter where you are in this process. I think there's only one NextEra in this room. And I encourage you to take just the next step wherever you are. As your program matures, WECC will be able to put increasingly more reliance on the work that you do. And this may be reflected in the approach that we take to your monitoring engagements, the ability for your organization to self-log, where we trust you to analyze your own low-risk non-compliance. Now, I don't want to discourage you if maturity seems a long way away. WECC's approach to your organization is also on a continuum. So we're not waiting for you to be perfect before you will see a change in our interactions. But I do want to leave you with a picture of maturity and what you're striving for. Executive support and a culture of excellence. Your culture will reward continuous improvement, implementation of lessons learned, any issues that are detected or remedied quickly. You'll see consistency across the organization. The risk mitigation is approached similarly in different areas. Assets are managed well, whether in a cyber or an operational environment. Your organization stays current on emerging risks and quickly addresses those risks. Controls are placed strategically. And finally, your organization displays a culture focused on improvement. Processes and incentives are in place to monitor for potential trouble areas and integrate lessons learned seamlessly. And this continuous improvement culture is something that all of us can start on today. And I'm ready for questions. Josh.
Hello. Molly, I'm not going to let you get away with not answering one question because I have a panel that's coming up and I'm sure I'm going to have to do the same.
I will ask you questions.
All right. So we have so many entities that are represented here and they're probably going to want to ask one question. They give us a lot of information on internal controls.
Yes.
The ICDCT interviews, RFIs.
Yes.
Is there any initiatives that WECC has in place currently or anything that's going to be implemented in the future on how we provide feedback on those controls to an entity? I know that's loaded.
That is very loaded.
Everybody in here probably wants to know the answer to that question. I want to know that answer as an auditor as well. So if you could just
Yes.
provide us some.
Definitely. So I'm not going to tell you what those initiatives are today because they have not yet been approved by management. So that would not be a great answer for me to give you. But I can tell you that there's a team working on improving that process right now. We do recognize that entities are asking for more feedback. The current feedback mechanisms, if you will, would be conversations that you have with your audit team during the audit, areas of concern, recommendations, positive observations would be your official information there. And then it should be, while maybe not spelled out in your compliance oversight plan, it definitely influences your compliance oversight plan. And sometimes you will see direct feedback in that plan. Does that answer your question, Josh? Okay.
Molly, we do have a question online. For entities that would like to leverage compliance discussions and concepts to mature their internal controls, is there a full copy of WECC's current ICDCT available, listing risks, control objectives for all standards and requirements?
Right, so there isn't and there won't be. The ICDCT is nothing more than an RFI tool. Think of it like the ERT, right? So it gives us the opportunity to tell you what our objectives are coming into the audit so that you can then tell us how your organization meets those objectives. And that's all it is. I don't want to put too much emphasis on the ICDCT for that reason. We're instead focusing on these controls guidance documents to give you a better understanding of the types of questions we think that your organization should be asking yourself. There are no right or wrong answers, and that we're not going to come in and say, you've made decisions that you need this control instead of that control. And, we're going to ask you how you meet objectives, not the specific methods, right? So I don't think it would be appropriate for us to fill out an ICDCT in advance. Also, those control objectives are tailored to your organization based on what we know about that organization. So we can't give you in advance, oh, we're going to ask you to tell us about this objective. There's going to be some overlap, but we're not going to, we're not going to ask you about every objective we've ever asked any entity. That wouldn't make sense. Monica?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a great presentation and so accessible in a simple format of, how to get at your internal controls and make them stronger. So thank you so much for putting this together. Quick question, there's been a lot of discussions, as you mentioned, in regards to reliability and security risks. I love how you kind of integrated that within the objectives, the control objectives, addressing those risks through the controls.
Yes.
So as we look to like ICDCT or internal control requests, in advance of audits or as part of, various engagements that we have with WECC, would it be, prudent for the entities to kind of be already sort of thinking and mapping to those bigger risk areas, their internal controls through those control objectives,
Sure.
and then probably tying it to standards as it makes sense for them to do so?
Yeah.
So that there is kind of a correlation there between the risk register to what the risks are for the entity to those standards that might be impacted from a compliance perspective?
Oh, yes. No, that makes a lot of sense for an entity approach, Monica. When we give you the ICDCT and also in the controls guidance documents, we tie it to a risk category, but often those risk categories are very, very broad. And it can be difficult sometimes to apply the concepts, across the risk categories. And I loved the NextEra conversation where they talked about asset management as applying to both SIP and OMP, because it does when you look at the risk category, right? But most of our entities aren't managing the same way. Their FAC 8 assets, their SIP 2 assets, they're using very different approaches. So I do love where I can see where that integrates, but it can't always. And then on the risk register, we have other risks called out that have implications for standards and requirements, but are not directly tied to them. So things like IBRs, right? IBRs are a risk, but what does that mean for your organization in terms of a standard and requirement? That might get a little clearer as we get into the GOP IBR standards, right? But for now, we're looking at things like modeling and planning standards, right, that are very important, but they're not necessarily going to correlate one-to-one with a standard and requirement. So looking at these higher reliability and security risks, and then thinking through, what controls do I have? Well, what processes do I have that support those higher level risks? And then what controls do I need to put in place to make sure that I meet my risk objective there? Would definitely be the way to go. And marking those as tying to standards and requirements does make sense, because I understand everyone in here is also needing to do that, right? You need to be able to respond to a WECC inquiry that is specific to standards and requirements as well. But do realize they don't always tie perfectly, as I think, was it Curtis? Did you say standards aren't perfect, right? So standards aren't perfect. We're also developing standards, right? And so we may be talking about a risk today that applies to a future standard, but doesn't apply to standards right now, so.
Thank you. I think that's so helpful because we've seen like in audit engagements and various monitoring activities, you guys already are asking about those risks that may not even be on existing standards, but maybe future standards or SARs that are in progress.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, when does WECC expect to republish their potential failure point and internal control guidance documents?
Okay, I'm not sure that I understand the question there entirely. So if whoever sent that in wants to clarify, that's great. What we're doing in terms of publishing them, we've kind of strategized about which ones are most likely to be important to entities. They tend to be the ones that either are where we see entities failing on a more routine basis. They may be standards that have new versions coming out. And so we want to make sure entities are prepared for the next version. There's several ways that we look at it. They may be standards that are in the CMEP IP. And so we make sure that we've got that CMEP IP covered. In terms of republishing, I'm going to assume that they mean when there are new versions of standards, and that is going to be, it's going to depend on the standard situation. It's going to depend on how much change has happened in the standard as to whether or not we feel like we need to prioritize that. Like I said, we have 26 of them out right now. How many standards do we have? 70 some, I don't remember. But that means we are not done, right? So the decision to update for a new version versus putting out a new guidance for something that we haven't put out a guidance for before, it's just a decision based on where we think the priorities are going to lie for the entities. I do want to point out, because that question may come from someone in the SIP side, and I know there's a lot of concern about these virtualization standards coming up, and we have them all on our radar to prioritize, but we're waiting until we have implementation dates and plans before we do that. We don't put something out before FERC has approved it. And if that didn't answer the question, you're welcome to resubmit the question.
Has WECC made a better than before guide for fully, partially, and not implemented assessments? Are there examples that WECC could provide?
No. I think there have, I think in the past, and I'm digging back into a history that I wasn't necessarily part of. So others may have better answers than I do, but I think, yes, in the past, we've used that fully, partially, and not implemented way of assessing standards or assessing controls. And we're really not using that terminology right now. We're using this effectiveness approach. Does the control effectively meet the objective? So we're looking at design, we're looking at implementation. If it's not implemented, then, it doesn't matter how well it's designed. But we're really looking for how effective that standard is.
I have a really long one, so
Okay.
let me know if I need to repeat anything. And also if we need to phone a friend, we can do that too. In an audit scenario where an entity has already provided evidence of compliance, the focus of interviews often shifts to how we ensure sustained compliance over time. From an auditor's perspective, what are they typically looking for in these discussions? Are they assessing the maturity of an organization's controls program, or are they expecting to hear specific details, such as whether a control is procedural, automated, preventative, detective, or corrective, or is it sufficient to broadly describe the controls we have in place, such as segregation of duties, checklists, or access controls, without classifying them further?
Okay, so I think I have that. And I did key in on the question from an auditor perspective. So I'm going to start by saying I am not an auditor. So I work closely with the audit teams. So since Josh was so kind, if he wants to jump up and help me out, I would more than welcome him to jump into this. But we don't care quite as much about how you bucketize your controls. So the question of, do we need to tell you if it's preventative or detective? I think from an auditor perspective, they can kind of tell that already, and they don't really need you to tell them, but they're much more concerned about the methods that you use to reach those objectives, because that's where they can see over time whether you're likely to be successful. I hope that answers the question. And Josh, do you have anything to add?
Well, payback came a little early. I think how we gather the data across the board is, it doesn't matter. If you provide it in a document, if you provide it verbally, we're just going to tease out all of that information that we get. The more organized it is, so we can see how those controls that you have map beyond your compliance activity and how well you're able to speak to those controls, gives us a confidence of how mature that program is. It's easy for me to say a control exists, but can you demonstrate that that control was effective? So some of the times we're serving multiple folks when we do our working papers. So it's not just we're taking the information, writing it down, and hoping that somebody in 3 years is going to pick this up and update your compliance oversight plan with the appropriate information. What we're looking for here is taking that data and giving it back to Molly and the risk team to show how those risks were mitigated. And so the more effectively that you can map that to a compliance activity, or let us know what associated preventive, detective, or any type of controls will help alleviate that risk. That's probably the biggest thing that we need. How pretty it looks, it's great if you want to put it in a nice document for us, but we want to make sure that your subject matter experts are able to talk through that. And so some of the questions you probably hear is, please walk me through your process. It may seem like we've never read your documentation before. We have. We've absolutely read your documentation, but we want to verify and validate that your subject matter experts are well aware of this. That's how we determine if a control is effective. Not that it's just written down, but do the subject matter experts beyond your compliance team know exactly what we're going to look for, what they're supposed to do? So that's what I would add, Molly.
Right. So I think that we said the same thing, right? Effectiveness in mitigating that risk. You need to be able to speak to how it's effective, what those risks are, right? And that could go beyond just a compliance discussion, right? It could be, how are you going to remain compliant in the future? But it also could be, how are you mitigating those reliability and security risks?
What is the feel of WECC on the impact of internal control on reliability improvement?
The impact of internal control on reliability improvement? Well, I mean, that's the point of internal controls, right? The point of internal controls is to make sure that you mitigate your risks, and you don't just stick with that inherent risk that says, I'm this size entity and I sit here in the grid, right? But that you think, oh, what could go wrong and how am I going to make sure that it doesn't go wrong? WECC's looking at controls specifically to mitigate reliability and security risks. Your business is probably looking at controls to mitigate other risks as well. But yeah, that's the point of internal controls. Tom's given me the signal it's time to wrap up. I don't know if there are other questions, Maylee, or if we want to wrap up.
You're off the hook. It's time for lunch.
Okay. Thank you.